I'm Liz Forbat, and I'm an Associate Professor of Ageing at the University of Stirling. So most of my background is as an academic, as a psychologist and then a research psychologist. And a lot of my focus is around ageing and serious ill health problems. So I've done a lot of work in cancer and palliative care. But alongside the academic work, I've trained as a family systemic psychotherapist, really driven by a passion to understand more about people's difficulties and to find a way of much more quickly kind of intervening and supporting people. So academic research can take 20 years to get evidence and then get it into practice. But sitting in a room with a family that's in distress and having difficulties, you can really feel like you can support them to make a difference within 50 minutes or an hour. So that's the balance of my interest in them, and that's why I run the two alongside each other. So my clinical work's focused largely around people with serious ill health problems. So that might be things like cancer, it might be other conditions that lead to the need for palliative care.
Okay, so my name's Lorraine Davies-Smith. I've recently retired from the English NHS, where I'd worked for many years as a systemic psychotherapist based in adult mental health, which is kind of unusual because a lot of systemic psychotherapists work in CAMS, in child and adolescent mental health services, but something I really enjoyed. Across the years, I've worked across primary care, what we now call IAPT, which is improving access to psychological therapies, through to severe and enduring mental health issues, including personality disorders and schizophrenia, bipolar, that kind of thing, and working with families. And over time, during my career, moving from being always remaining a therapist, but also becoming a lead for teams and lead for services and helping to develop new services.
Yeah, so AFT is the Association of Family Therapy. It's a UK-wide organisation, and it provides a number of different things for practitioners and for the public. So for practitioners, it provides a kind of infrastructure to set the standards for training for family therapists and systemic practitioners. It promotes and develops research. It supports the professional journal, the Journal of Family Therapy, those kind of functions. So very much thinking about standards and how we all practice. And then for members of the public, it also provides, the website provides a kind of find a therapist function so that members of the public can go in and look for somebody in their local area that can provide a service.
So what does it do? It begins to think about an individual within a network of relationships. And these networks are commonly referred to as systems. So that can be a family system, a friendship system, it could be a religious system, a professional system, and each system that we're a member of, and we often we're members of many systems simultaneously as a person, each system we're a member of, we influence that system by being part of it, but we're also influenced by the system. And the system, so for instance, in a professional working system, there might be certain expectations of you within that system, but equally you're feeding in sometimes to change the system if things aren't working through that feedback process. You're trying to get to understand where each individual in the system, where their beliefs and meanings are coming from, and then how they interact with each other member of the system. And that's how you hope to induce some kind of change, by better understanding each person's position and beliefs and meanings that they bring. You know, one of the things I think that the systemic model, it's kind of at the core of it, is this idea of it being a non-blaming, non-pathologizing type of stance. So we're not looking, you know, often if a family comes in distress, there's a sort of story the family's built up about somebody is the problem, somebody's behaviour is the issue. And actually what we're trying to look at is the system overall and the interaction between the constituent parts of that system. So we're not looking to blame any one person. So that's something we hold dear. And the other thing that we hold dear is something called context. And that context is about what's also referred to as the social graces. So we're very keen on thinking about things like gender, ethnicity, age, ability, class, religion, and how all those sexuality, all those kinds of contextual issues come together and both influence the system that someone's a part of and the individuals within the system. Because without context, someone's behaviour maybe doesn't seem as logical as it might then seem once you add context to it.
For me, systemic practice is a very active form of therapy. I think people sometimes think of counselling or therapy as being, you know, a practitioner sitting and doing a lot of mm-hmm-ing and nodding. And I guess what I see, both for myself and other practitioners I've seen, is very dynamic, very interactive, often quite lively, often quite funny, like there's a lot of humour that people bring in. And I think that's because you need some of the humour to engage with people, and that relationship is so important, both within the family that you're supporting, but also the relationship between therapist and family. And also because it's a very dialogical approach, so it's very much based on the dialogue and the conversation that you're having with clients. So just thinking about older people and mental health problems that might be likely to crop up and warrant the kind of support that a family therapist might offer. I mean, I think depression is something that affects people across all age ranges, and is often underdiagnosed in older people. So the fact that the statistics don't show lots of older people being diagnosed with depression is more a problem with how diagnoses are managed rather than whether or not there's a problem there. Suicide rates actually are higher in older people than they are in younger. And I think, you know, the kind of messaging that we get about suicide is that it's a problem for primarily young men, but actually the relationship between depression and suicide is a real concern for older people. And I guess, you know, the impact of isolation on mental health as people get older, and some of the changes in daily living that people have as they grow older and perhaps are impacted by physical health problems. And all of those things can really impact and make worse people's mental health and well-being in a way that isn't so much of a concern for other age groups.
They're going to have had a lifetime of being connected to one another and having ideas about one another and beliefs about one another. And, you know, as sometimes happens in families, sometimes there is a family member who is the one that, you know, when we're in trouble, we go to X, and X is always really helpful, and, you know, I can rely on X, and somebody else gets a reputation of being perhaps not quite so reliable, always busy with their own life. And of course, those things can come into sharp relief at the time when somebody's really ill with, you know, a disease where they need to be cared for. And depending on how able people are able to talk about that and say, this isn't okay now, I don't want to be that person that's relied on, I want some help, I need some help, that's when it can go underground and fester. And I think that's where systemic psychotherapy can be really helpful. So in a non-judgmental way, to track, how do you normally come together around issues? How do you normally come together around crises? Is that okay for you all? Does it work for you all, or do you want it to be different? If it were to be different, what room for manoeuvre is there? So you're beginning to get the family system to reflect on their own processes and think about how they've organised themselves up to now, and whether it's the way to go forward or whether a reorganisation is required. In a way, the issue that brings people together, in this case, let's say the dementia, whilst there are things specific to that issue that the families might need around sort of understanding some psychoeducation of what's going to happen and what's likely to happen, I think alongside that again are still the same kind of processes. How do we talk about this as a care system, whether it's the family or the families and the professionals? How do we organise ourselves? What are our own internal beliefs about how things should be done? And how does that fit with the other members of the care system who might have other ideas? And that's sometimes where I think in families then it can get a little tricky, because people are coming at it with different beliefs about the best way forward. How do we communicate our fears in a way that's okay for me to be vulnerable and say, this is what I worry about for the future, and know that people are going to hear that in a gentle and kind way? So whilst dementia might be the thing that brings people together around something, I think some of the issues that come up would be similar, whatever the issue was in a way. Albeit I think there are some specific things around dementia that people might need in terms of information and psychoeducation, that kind of thing.
Mm. I think if I can add to that, one of the elements that Lorraine touched on was the idea of psychoeducation for families. Not all therapists actually are that aware of what it means to be working with families affected by dementia. So there is something about actually therapists having their own psychoeducation and understanding what the neurodevelopmental changes are for the individual, and how that might impact the wider family system. And that not all dementias are the same. So if we understand dementia to be an umbrella diagnosis under which several other kinds of conditions come, and Alzheimer's and vascular dementia being the main two in the UK population, then understanding actually what that means for the family as those conditions progress. So I'm going to use my hands here to create for you a really well used graph. So, and they're kind of called disease trajectories, and what happens over time as people's conditions progress. So with something like Alzheimer's disease, so that's your axes. With Alzheimer's disease, what you tend to get is a fairly kind of continuous, and it goes on for quite a long time. People can live with Alzheimer's disease for a decade. With vascular dementia, what you'd expect to see is more kind of peaks and troughs, but with that gradual decline too. So as people have perhaps mini strokes, then the function would decline over time. And why that's important, and why the psychoeducation around that is important, is because the therapist and the family then need to understand how that's going to impact on how people are then relating. So with somebody with a very steady, long trajectory and change over time, it's going to be really different than somebody who's been very functionally fit and active, and then suddenly has some other kind of catastrophic thing to do with aging. So maybe they have one large stroke. So that's going to change the needs and demands on caregivers and other members of the family, and it may well change how the individual living with the diagnosis is able to communicate their own point of view. So there's a lot kind of mixed up between the biopsychosocial, the biological, the psychological, and the social elements that really need to kind of be unpicked by people that can hold the distress around what is known and also what's not known. The context of palliative care really chimes with all sorts of other times at which people seek therapy. So people struggling with relationships or communication, depression, other kind of mental health problems. The thing that makes palliative care a bit different is that people tend to recognise that they have a very limited time to get this right. And I think with other therapeutic contexts, there's a sense that you could probably put it off a bit, and if now doesn't feel quite right, then maybe it will feel better in a year's time to see. Whereas when people are receiving palliative care services, which tends to be in the last months, but maybe years of life, people are aware that really they've got a very limited time now to try and repair the relational fault lines that have cropped up to date. So I think that's a kind of core thing. and that sense that there's no kind of do-overs, so you can't just return to it at another point in time. Another similarity, I guess, with other areas is this idea that you're kind of looking at the next generation. And so with a limited time to kind of fix whatever, or to attend to whatever's going on in the here and now, has also got the dying person's sense that they want to leave a legacy of having managed and sorted out whatever's happening. So I say that's the dying person, but actually the surviving people might also have that as their frame of reference.
First of all, who's the person that is, you know, who's making the decision the person needs help? It's really hard to be told that you need help if you haven't arrived there. And sometimes people don't arrive there because maybe there's a cognitive issue, maybe such as a dementia and Alzheimer, where they really struggle to see themselves in that way. Or maybe they haven't arrived there because their self-identity as such. You know, I can remember my friend's mum saying to me when I was, about 19, she says, the strange thing about aging is, you know, inside I'm still 19, just like you are. But then I look in the mirror and somebody else looks back at me. So I think there's this kind of internal identity that we have. And even though physically things may be changing, maybe who we experience ourselves as doesn't change quite as quickly. And that leads me to think about, who was this person in their younger life? You know, were they the go-to person to help others? Well, that takes a huge shift then to suddenly become the person that's accepting the help in terms of your self-identity. What's the meaning of accepting help? Do they have something from their history where, you know, a favourite auntie, a parent got to the point where they needed help and they died very quickly after that? And so is there a fear underneath accepting help, which says, if I go down this road, I know what might be next and I'm not ready for that? So again, for me, it's always unpacking, trying to understand what's underneath the behaviour. What are the beliefs that are informing the behaviour? What's the meaning given to the behaviour? Rather than taking a position of, you're just being really awkward, you need help and you won't accept it and I'm getting really irritated now, because actually that doesn't help anyone. So for me, it's always looking for what's behind the behaviour, what's feeding the behaviour, rather than seeing the behaviour as wrong.
I suppose the only other element is about reciprocity. And I think there's sometimes a danger that socially we get into this idea that older people need stuff and they receive, and younger generations give stuff. And actually relationships don't really work like that. And over the history of a relationship, and in almost any given sort of year or month, there is a back and forth and there is reciprocal exchange. So I think that there is that part of working with families to think about what's still being given and received, rather than just seeing it as a one direction transaction.
What came to my mind, Liz, was you know, I mean, that very basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how, you know, I don't know if your readers or yourself are familiar with this, but, you know, the idea that first of all, you've got to have your very basic survival needs met: food, water, warmth, shelter. And then you need your safety needs met, and your belonging, and you talked about belongingness, your belongingness needs met. And for many people, their home give you those basic things. They're where I'm safe, it's where I'm familiar, I've got all my memories here of my life and what went before. And so it's a really emotional wrench, as well as, again, I think of fear coming in. And I think anytime we activate fear, people lose the ability to, and whatever your age, not just elderly people, lose the ability to think logically, because you're driven by the emotion of fear and loss and almost trauma at that stage. So I think it's about, for me, before you foist something on somebody, really taking time to understand with them, what would they need to take with them to help them remain connected and feel safe, and what would need to be in place to help that move? And maybe if we waited 3 months, would it be easier then than doing it right now? Is it safe to do that? If they're not well, maybe it's not safe to do that. So those are the kinds of ideas that come up for me.
There is something about loss tied in all of this. So if you're thinking about somebody transitioning from their own home into a care facility, even if it's supported living, but they've had to go from a 3-bedroomed house to a 1-bedroomed apartment, there's a huge amount of loss tied up in the bricks and mortar, maybe the garden, how you hang your things around the house. And you know, people will be watching this video thinking about and interpreting what they can see behind the video in each of us, and interpreting things about people's identity and importance in relation to that. So I think even though we don't often consciously think about how we look or the things that are around us, when you start to think about picking somebody up and putting them into a new environment, all of those losses, which are also tied up in overall loss, the ultimate loss of your own death, it just becomes amplified. So I think that's some of the stress, and that people get hung up on the idea that maybe a photo or two in the care home will link you back to, you know, your family and people you love, when actually it's not really about just that.
Also, you know, I was thinking about this in relation to my mother, who a number of years ago, through her own free will, decided to sell her house, and she moved into supported accommodation. So she's got one of these sort of flats of her own, but it's within a block and there's a warden who lives in there. And there was something about that transition, because she did it voluntarily, that she's really at peace with. And it made me think about what happens when you're asked to do any kind of transition and you're not ready for it and it's not voluntary. You know, if somebody came to any of us three tomorrow and said, oh, and by the way, in 3 months' time, you're moving, by the way, and you've got no choice in this, I guess we'd have quite a difficult reaction to that. And why would we expect somebody, just because they're a few years older, to have a different reaction? You know, it's a big thing, isn't it? Albeit, I know it's done for very good reasons sometimes and for people's safety. But I guess there's something about walking in someone else's shoes through the process and understanding it from their perspective. I mean, you know, every family will have a different level of tolerance to conflict, for instance. You know, some families work in a way that everything's always incredibly polite, but actually underneath that, there's a lot of unsaid stuff. So they don't come into therapy when there's conflict. They often come into therapy when somebody might be showing some kind of physical symptom because the stress is too much, but it's not getting spoken about. For other families, they're much more kind of out there, but the conflict can then rise quite high. So I think different families will have different ways of knowing when they've reached their limit of what they can do without, if you like, a neutral person to help them to get a better understanding and to talk about things more openly. And I suppose for me, as I hear myself say that, I think there's often a lot of emphasis on talking and not so much emphasis on listening. And often what I think in therapy happens is we learn the skill of really listening to each other. And when we really listen to the other people, we get a better understanding of why they're behaving in the way they're behaving, or how they've arrived at the opinion they've arrived at, or the position they've arrived at. Once we have some understanding, that often makes us more open to being able to find solutions, because suddenly it's moved from a position of obstructiveness that I just do not understand to a position of, oh, I get it now. I understand that now. Oh, well, let's see what we can do about that. So, yeah, listening, I think, is probably the greatest gift that therapy gives people sometimes.
I suppose in terms of what your readers or watchers might be interested in for themselves, so different people will need different things. Most people won't need a highly specialist psychotherapist to support them. You know, the vast majority of the population manage on their own. Here comes a little diagram. So most people fit along, you know, the main part of the triangle there. The majority are going to support themselves and each other. They're going to track along okay. Somewhere in the middle of that triangle, a smaller proportion of people are going to probably need some low-level kind of supports, maybe peer support, other caregiver groups, maybe other groups for people supporting those with certain conditions, that kind of thing. And then right at the pointy bit of the triangle, that's likely to be the people that would most benefit from highly specialist therapists. Those people, as Lorraine's indicated, are most likely to be the ones that engage in conversation in more of a kind of overtly distressed way, where there's maybe hostility or a pattern of kind of sullenness that gets in the way of full communication. There have been some research studies done in palliative care to look at triaging and prioritizing people and to understand what proportion fit in each bit of that triangle, and both for family therapy support, but also for bereavement support. And you're really looking at that pointy end of the triangle, 5–10% of people. So I guess if readers, listeners are wondering if they fit in that area, then it's about whether or not they've tried any of the kind of informal peer support type stuff. And if that's not really met their needs, then they should refer themselves, speak to the GP perhaps, to look at escalating that to get more sophisticated support.
And Liz, you're based in Scotland. I'm based in in England. I know from experience that actually accessing that kind of support is very, very limited in England. I don't know if it's different in Scotland. And, you know, because we've been set up with the NHS, which is fantastic and marvellous, they're interested in diagnoses, and families in distress is not at this moment in time a kind of medical diagnosis, although actually what happens is, in my experience, is if families are in enough distress, some members of the family, at least one, maybe sometimes more than one, will develop some kind of diagnosis, whether it's a stress or a depression or an anxiety or something of that nature. And actually being able to intervene before people get to that point, I think would be much more desirable. I don't know the system is actually set up to do that so well at the moment. And then you do get people who, as you say, you know, they might go to the AFT website to find a therapist, and they pay privately because they feel they don't want their family to break down in some way or to grow apart in some way. But I would really love to see that kind of help available through the NHS, but we're not quite there yet. Or it's very patchy and very little what is available, sadly.
Is a lot the same as keeping well at any other age. So diet, exercise, not consuming tobacco, those kind of things. But specific to aging, I guess some of the real concerns that you see in the research evidence is around the impact of isolation and loneliness. So actually, one of the most important things that older people can do, or families that are worried about older people, is to think about what kind of connectedness they can have in place for the older person. So things like, you know, lunch clubs or letter writing or whatever fits with the social context. You know, we're recording this in July 2020 and COVID is rampant and has really impacted lots of people's social connections. And there's real concern, a very clear and strong evidence base that people with reduced social connectivity and increased isolation are at much higher risk of mental health problems like depression and anxiety. So above and beyond anything else, older people need to be supported to grow and maintain and maybe even increase their social networks. You know, there's a real paucity, a real thinness of relationships as people grow older, and the relationships shrink and shrink and shrink over time. So I think there's a real need as individuals, as families, and as a community to find ways to support the the enhancement and growth of relationships.
And I would echo that. And something about those relationships as well, being across the age range, that, you know, old people don't just want to talk to other old people. As much as that might be enjoyable, it's lovely to be around people of all sorts of ages. And especially young people. I think that I actually think, you know, this the way grandparents have been cut off from grandchildren at the moment is detriment because of COVID. It's been very detrimental to both age ranges, actually.